The only way to avoid further catastrophic loss of life in Ukraine is for some kind of negotiated settlement. That means world leaders should be trying to lower the heat instead of raising it. But Joe Biden this weekend didn't appear to have gotten that message.
So in this hour, let the words of Pope John Paul burn as brightly today. Never, ever give up hope. Never doubt. Never tire. Never become discouraged. Be not afraid. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase a people's love for liberty. Brutality will never grind down their will to be free. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principle, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God defend our freedom.
The suggestion that the US is seeking regime change will be explosive in Russia, feeding Putin's argument that this is an existential battle between Russia and the West. And that's presumably why that statement wasn't in Biden's pre-prepared script. He had ad-libbed, and his staffers were left to roll back on what he had said. So a Biden administration official briefed the press after that speech. The president's point was that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors or the region. He was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change. Now, that's a very, very awkward rolling back, because there is no understanding of what he said that would have meant that. But I do kind of believe that that was an accident. We know Biden, he's the kind of guy that has mistakenly referred to Ukraine as Iran before. He is not someone who doesn't make these kind of mistakes, and I don't think they necessarily are that calculated when he makes them. This also isn't the first time Biden's staff have had to clarify his statements with regard to Ukraine in a way which, appeared escalatory. Earlier last week, this is how Biden responded to a question about what America would do if Russia deployed chemical or biological weapons.
And to clarify on chemical weapons, if chemical weapons were used in Ukraine, would that trigger a military response from NATO?
It would trigger a response in kind. Whether or not you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make that decision at the time.
By saying the US would react in kind, Biden led many to assume the US would respond to a chemical weapon attack in Ukraine by deploying its own chemical weapons. But his national security advisor insisted that wasn't what Biden meant, saying the United States has no intention of using chemical weapons, period, under any circumstance.
I mean, what better symbol of American decline than this? Out of 330 million people, the two men they choose to govern America are first a reality TV star with chronic narcissism, and then the wandering resident of a retirement home who seems to have lost his pills. As the Soviet Union entered the 1980s, it was ruled by a rotating clique of semi-senile apparatchiks stuck in the past, soon forced into a humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a state in chaos and crisis, and the echoes are striking now in today's Moscow and Washington, both of them. America's a gerontocracy ruled by a group of friends in their 70s and 80s, not least the sons and wives of past presidents. It's a one-party state, but as Kwame Nkrumah put it, with typical American arrogance, they have two of them. And this is a lesson about what democracy is and what it isn't. If elections become lavish circuses for rival plutocrats and their hangers-on, you end up with embarrassing and incompetent leaders. That's the story of Joe Biden. And I'm reminded of those stories about Ronald Reagan needing to have a group of advisors with him at all times who monitored everything he said and did because they knew he was a kind of empty shell as he went increasingly senile. It's a sign not only of a society in bad health, but of a democracy that has mutated into, to use a term often on our lips these days, an oligarchy. An oligarchy isn't just when rich people sit in office and cover it in gold, as Donald Trump did. It's also when rival groups of plutocrats sponsor their rival politicians and don't care how competent they are, whether they can even string a sentence together, as long as they loyally represent the interests of wealth and power. It's a very sad sign for a country that goes around the world talking about freedom and democracy.
I think everyone will agree that Biden's age makes him a poor communicator. Some people would argue, though, that potentially he's a little bit better in his old age than he was when he was a younger senator. He used to be considered quite hawkish. Now, as president, he's withdrawn America from Afghanistan, at least since the Ukraine crisis intensified when Russia invaded. he doesn't seem to have been trying to consciously escalate. He accidentally escalates every now and again. Do you think that maybe, age means that he is a bit less irresponsible than sort of like a younger liberal might have been in this situation?
Well, I think the young Joe Biden is liberal only by a big stretch of the imagination. I mean, this was a guy who delivered a eulogy at the funeral of a segregationist leader who opposed busing legislation to desegregate the South and supported war all around the world. And yet was also prone to gaffes and moments of incompetence even as a young man. He had to withdraw from a presidential campaign decades ago because he plagiarized that great art of rhetoric, Neil Kinnock. So it's not new that Joe Biden combines a kind of all-American bravado, a kind of all-American machismo with heavy lashing of incompetence. As I say, I think that's why he's a useful idiot for the kind of wealthy interests in American politics that line up behind rival Democrats and Republicans each election cycle. In fact, many of the biggest corporations give handy donations to both Democrats and Republicans. He manages to be both incompetent and, as commander-in-chief of the world's biggest imperial power, dangerous. But unfortunately, that's been true of every American president I can think of.